Chapter 114 Stardust Becoming Nebula. Cold. It was just like dozens of small needles were entering her skin. It felt like her blood was completely frozen, unable to circulate around her body. Yi Xinxia's breathing within the fridge was getting slower, the rise and fall of her chest was clearly decreasing. The coldness and sleepiness were intertwining. If she were to close her eyes now, she'd silently fall asleep. If I fall asleep now, then I'll never open my eyes again. Yi Xinxia suddenly bit her lip, forcing herself to wake up. The two colossal-eyed ape rats didn't seem to have any intentions of leaving. Their noises were not too far away from where Yi Xinxia was hiding. Yi Xinxia herself didn't know how much longer she would be able to persist. From how she saw it, it would be much better to freeze to death in the fridge than to become food for the colossal-eyed ape rats. As the air got increasingly thinner, Yi Xinxia tried to adjust her breathing as much as possible. Her mind couldn't help but drift off into nicer memories. Creak, hiss, boom, boom. A few deep imprints had been fiercely smashed in on the iron door of the control room, and the sound of the black beast's claws scraping on the door was clearly audible. These black beasts were very obedient when it came to their master's commands. They knew that Mo Fan was hiding in this place, and if they didn't personally rip Mo Fan's body in two, then they definitely would not leave. Their sharp claws slowly but surely ripped into and shredded the iron door, causing cracks to appear. As soon as cracks appeared on it, the process of destroying the door became much easier. After these black beasts first cracked the iron door, they became like prisoners who had seen the open light. They began to shriek in excitement. Moreover, they began to take turns using their claws on the door. On the other side of the door, Mo Fan was sitting down. He could no longer turn a blind eye to the imminent danger. He was able to hear the sound of the door being shredded. The black beast's shrieking noises became increasingly clearer as the crack began to widen. It's just, what was the point of being completely struck by terror? Whether he was able to survive was completely dependent on the two stardusts within his spirit world. The purple and red stardust began to emit a strong, then weak radiance. A canopy of faint light was enveloping his two stardusts on the outside, while inside, the stardust blossomed a radiance that was about to break through the hazy light canopy. The light canopy was like an eggshell, or a cocoon. It held energy capable of breaking through the shell. It looked like the canopy was immovable under the attack of magic energy, yet there was a clear swelling that was caused by the rummaging energy within. "Break for me," Mo Fan shouted from his heart. On his chest, the little loach pendant's radiance seemed to be transferred into the attacking power of Mo Fan's stardust. Its original emanation had turned into a sudden condensation. Just like many small rivers, they converged into a great river, and the once quiet great river suddenly rushed forth. The surging wave ferociously smashed into the dam across the river. Cracks finally emerged on the outer shell. "It's nearly done. It's nearly done." Mo Fan's insides began to fill with excitement. He was only crazed about breaking into the next level. Mo Fan could already feel his mind suffering from a huge energy rebound, generating an immense headache. Initially, Mo Fan believed that he couldn't do it at all. The impact of the mental feedback was just like a sword piercing through his brain, or like the waves of the sea crashing into each other in the midst of a storm. Mo Fan had never experienced this kind of mental impact during his training. It was much worse than exhausting his whole energy. It was a nightmare filled with torment and destruction. And in the process, if his mentality loosened just a little, or he had a single thought of giving up, then the all-out attack would vanish in an instant. He would then need to start all over again. Mo Fan felt that his head was about to explode. His veins were bulging all over his face, but he was afraid to let go. Truthfully, this pain was no less than being ripped apart by the black beasts. A person that had a weak fortitude would have given up at the very beginning, but Mo Fan had committed to it with his very last breath. Closing his eyes, the last flashback that he saw was a girl on the verge of death. If the girl was ripped apart by a colossal-eyed ape rat, Mo Fan believed that he would have to bear a lot more pain for the rest of his life. The mental impact was magnifying, increasing fivefold from its original strength. Mo Fan ground his teeth and persisted. Tenfold. Mo Fan rolled up his tongue, scared that he was unable to control his own body, and bit off the end of his own tongue. Inside him, his spirit world was full of raging storms. The purple and red stardusts looked as if they were about to perish. In the hugely churning spirit realm, they were dulling abruptly. The light ray was getting weaker and weaker, not even like a distant star. It looked like it was about to disappear into the dark night. At this moment, Mo Fan suddenly opened his eyes. His pupils were expanding inhumanly. In his eyes, there was an endless universe. In the deepest depths were his dimming lightning and fire stardusts. His pupils widened. Mo Fan's entire face trembled. The two deathly still stardusts suddenly burst out with an incredibly hot radiance, and to his surprise, flooded his entire spiritual universe at incredible speed. The purple was so gorgeous that it brightened the entire star universe. It was beautiful and stunning. The fiery red that ignited the darkness was sparkling and surging. Their flight and their shrouds, they looked as though they were creating their own little universes, their own star homes. However, what was created was no longer the same as the small little stardust that had been sitting in one corner of the universe like before. He had created a star cluster like a cloud. They were all condensed into a dense cluster and reflected upon each other. Stardust becoming nebula. Experiencing all of this, Mo Fan felt like his blood was boiling. Stardusts were truly like dust within the vast universe, existing, but also extremely insignificant. Thus, the energy they were able to provide for a magician could be considered relatively limited. However, the nebula was completely different from a stardust. The large group of stars occupied a huge area. Their radiance could be described as brilliant. They were extremely visible in the vast spiritual universe, dominating his chaotic spiritual world. Dust and nebulous clouds, the difference between the two was very clear. If every little star's light contained magic energy, then how much energy would this densely packed nebula cloud contain, and just what level of magic would they be able to create? Within the nebula were the extremely important stars that magicians used to cast magic. It was a little different from before. Within this vivid nebula, there were a total of 49 stars. These stars were moving around the nebula, just like when Mo Fan had awakened his elements, dazzling him. This kind of feeling, Mo Fan looked at his hands in disbelief. On his left hand, there was a thirsty fire rising from his skin. As it ignited, it felt as though he had unlimited magical energy. On his right hand, the lightning arcs were like crackling lines of purple ivy as they covered the whole of his fist. The lightning looked as though it was striving for his favor against the flames, like a conceited brat that thirsted for a chance to demonstrate its strengths. Chapter 115: The Violent Fire Element, Fierce Fist. Simultaneous Breakthrough. Mo Fan looked at the countless amounts of abundant magical energy. The feeling in his heart couldn't be described as just mere excitement. Normally speaking, as long as either stardust broke through to a nebula, then he could be regarded as an intermediate magician. Thus, whether Mo Fan's lightning stardust or his fire stardust became a nebula, he would still be able to enter the intermediate realm. However, he had actually broken through with both of his elements. This was something that he had never expected. Shriek. An ear-piercing shriek shook Mo Fan's ears, following which was the noise of the iron door being torn apart by the black beasts. Mo Fan was standing in front of the door. His eyes held an inextinguishable flame that was completely fixated on the greedy, ugly things. The black beasts were the symbol of the Black Vatican. They actually weren't summoned beasts at all. They were creatures that were created using parts of human corpses and demonic energy. They were closer to being undead spirits. Other than liking massacres, their biggest hobby was to make everyone else into a slave of the darkness, just like them. This kind of jealousy and hatred was infectious. It motivated them all. How could a small iron door resist their thirst? When their avaricious tendencies were not being shown, they were just freaks that enjoyed tormenting others. When it came to killing, their avaricious tendencies would be increasingly frightening. Their green eyes, and the saliva that was dripping down from their jaws. Their restlessly agitated claws, and their hungry calls. Perhaps half an hour ago, if there were more than 2 of these creatures appearing, then it would be a nightmare for a primary magician like Mo Fan. Their speed was enough to dodge a primary magic spell, and they'd slyly collaborate in battle. However, now, this crowd of creatures was just like a group of pitiable fools in Mo Fan's eyes, poor little clowns. His transformed eyes were no longer showing dread, they were showing disdain and arrogance, like a higher-class creature was looking down on them. Mo Fan was standing there, letting them tear off the iron door. Swah! The iron door was finally torn open, and in that time, the few black beasts that were at the very front began to frantically squeeze themselves into the place. It was like they thought biting his flesh would cause their evil souls to rise to a higher level. Their heads were fiercely moving closer as their bodies were still stuck in the hole of the door. The black beasts in the back were urgently squeezing in as they let out anxious shrieks. The Mo-fan who saw this scene was not flustered at all. He slowly withdrew his Star Atlas book. The Star Atlas book was clutched in his hands as he frantically poured magic energy into it. The book suddenly floated in front of Mo-fan, and before his eyes, it turned into specks of stars. As the book disappeared, the bizarre Star Atlas on it shot into Mo-fan's pupils. 1 star, 2 stars, 3 stars. The stars of Mo-fan's fire nebula seemed as though they had received a summons. They impatiently began to link to each other. First, they were linked into a star path, and for Mo-fan, this was something he was overly familiar with. It was precisely the bridge he had formed when he was doing primary magic. However, what Mo-fan cast this time was definitely not primary magic. The star path was currently being linked, and the second star path had finally emerged within the magic star nebula. Stars forming into star paths, and the star paths were interweaving with one another. Their fantastic interweaving had turned into a beautiful and moving star atlas within the nebula. This was a star atlas. This was the bottleneck of an even higher magic. This was the door to intermediate magic. 49 stars, they became a beautiful star atlas under the summoning of the Star Atlas book. These patterns didn't just sparkle within Mo-fan's pupils, their traces appeared beneath his feet. A star atlas beneath his feet. A colossal power began to frantically pour into Mo-fan's body, and his body began to boil. Fierce fist. Mo-fan fiercely chanted the name of the fire intermediate magic. His blood was completely boiling under the heat. His gaze was proudly fixed on those black beasts that wanted to kill him, and from within the flames, one could see Mo-fan had a frenzied smile on his face. "I'll deliver you to the heavens," Mo-fan declared, word by word. In a split second, the fiery flames within his body were completely concentrated on Mo-fan's right hand and within his tightly gripped fist. Within his fist, a ball of fire was curling around, a ball that was able to kill everything in its way. Bearing his anger for these creatures that attempted to destroy his hometown, and their massacre of the people he cared for, the raging flames that were ready to erupt at any time fiercely shot out at the roar of Mo-fan. The raging flames covering Mo-fan's fist were shot out. The surroundings of Mo-fan's fist were turned into a gigantic blazing halo, and following this came the all-devouring flames. The raging flames were in the form of a gigantic fist. It was nearly as big as a wall. What iron door? Mo-fan's fierce fist exploded upon the entire wall. So what if those massacring dark beasts were charging in? Mo-fan's fierce fist was massacring all of the black beasts. The majestic flames were burning. The entire wall was turned into black ashes beneath the power of the gigantic fierce fist. Within the red flames, the first black beast that was met with the colossal fierce fist had turned out just like the wall. You could clearly see that it had turned into scorched ashes beneath the powerful explosion. Shriek. On the corridor, the black beasts that were going to throw themselves upon the delicious food were now frantically shrieking. Just the heat waves touching their body caused them to be so scared that they wanted to flee anywhere. When the colossal, destructive flame fist arrived, those black beasts that were unable to flee in time had been turned into ashes at the very center of the flames. The temperature around the fierce fist wasn't very high. However, that didn't mean the black beasts with good reflexes were able to escape. They were thirsting to be the first one to taste Mo-fan's flesh, and thus, they were all initially stuck in the door. As Mo-fan threw this one fist over, he had essentially caught all of them. Additionally, the area of effect of the colossal fist of flames was about the size of a wall. What could they do even if they were to run? Bang! 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 The first wall of the control room was turned into black powder. The opposite wall of the corridor was blown into pieces. The external reinforced glass was split open. The force of the colossal flame fist immediately poured into the dining room to the right, filling it to the brink, and then it wrecked the windows of the dining hall as the flames poured out. The black beasts that weren't being scorched into ashes by the high temperature were all blown into the dining hall from the corridor, and then hurled from the window to the outside. They could no longer scream. The 6 black beasts that were enveloped in flames ruthlessly fell from the 3rd floor of the shopping center. At the same time, the entire sky was filled with glass and fragments of tables that were completely immolating as they rained down. The entire floor was hit by a shockwave, and the entire shopping mall began to tremble from it. The destruction caused by Fierce Fist didn't last for long, but it had turned a wall, a corridor, and a Western-style dining hall into nothingness in an instant. 4 out of the 10 black beasts had directly perished. Even if the remaining 6 were alive, it was probable that they would no longer be able to climb up again. They were all collapsed outside of the shopping mall with burning parts of the building accompanying them. Chapter 116 Saving Xinxia. Mo Fan stood inside the half of the control room left, looking past the charred remains. The entire plaza could be seen in plain sight. A few one-eyed magic wolves were roaming around the plaza. It clearly looked like they hadn't found the food they were looking for before a huge bang was heard, and all of their focus was fixed on the hole that had suddenly appeared. One of the smaller one-eyed magic wolves watched those 6 nearly dead black beasts. It was frightened as it looked over to its comrade. Instead, its comrade looked at the human that was standing near the edge of the gigantic black hole, and its whole body shivered unwillingly. When both eyes of the beasts met, those 2 one-eyed magic wolves ran away in panic from Minwen Plaza. It was easy to imagine that these 2 one-eyed magic wolves' thoughts were shattered, thinking inside that they were lucky. Holy shit, lucky we didn't go that way. Watching those 2 fleeing one-eyed magic wolves, Mo Fan was still in a boiling state. This is the intermediate class of fire element. This is the intermediate class of fire element. This is magic. This is real magic. The beginner's magic we learned was so weak compared to this. Damn you Eng, that effing Black Vatican dog, is still thinking of killing your grandpa, Mo Fan? Shit, I can't reveal anymore. Xinxia is still in danger. Mo Fan belatedly noticed this important matter and stopped caring about those dying black beasts. He darted towards the Walmart at once. After reaching intermediate magician, Mo Fan felt that his own body had a noticeable change. He ran to the railing, and simply jumped down from the 3rd floor. Landing, both his legs were quite stable. Mo Fan didn't dare to waste another second, darting towards the Walmart. Normally, Mo Fan would take the time to think about how to deal with those 2 giant-eyed ape rats wandering around the Walmart. But now, one ignite immediately blew away the iron door of Walmart. Who cared how many giant-eyed ape rats were in the store? Mo Fan rushed in, looking through the rows and rows of shelves, rapidly locking on and running toward the freezer on the monitoring screen. Mo Fan was running frantically, before coming into a semi-spacious cargo channel. At this moment, those 2 giant-eyed ape rats peeked out after they heard a movement. When they saw a living human, those 2 giant-eyed ape rats began to make an excited sound. They moved onto the long shopping walkway and jumped towards Mo Fan. The giant-eyed ape rats were fast, their huge front teeth gaped wide in the air. Go die! Fire Fist! Below his foot, a drawing of fire element energy was glowing brightly. The fire rapidly condensed around Mo Fan's wrists and held tightly around his right fist. Pung! 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 Upon releasing the fire punch, the shelves on both sides of the aisle burned down to ash under its power. These 2 giant-eyed ape rats could only regret that they were already halfway in their charging towards him. Were they blind? Didn't they recognize that this was an intermediate-class human magician? That giant, rampaging fire punch couldn't be endured by their weak bodies. The raging fire engulfed them, turning them into ash, all in the blink of an eye. Mo Fan controlled his release just a little. After successfully killing the 2 giant-eyed ape rats, he withdrew the power of his fire fist, or else if it kept going, the explosive power would set the Walmart ablaze. If it hurt Xinxia, that would be such a great crime. Xinxia! Xinxia! Mo Fan didn't even bother looking at the ashes, impatiently heading towards the end of the freezer section. The wheelchair in front of him, that giant freezer, also reached his sight. Mo Fan rushed to the front of the freezer. Inside the freezer, Yi Xinxia was lying there like a sleeping beauty. Her skin was originally fair, but now it was a scarily pale white. Her peaceful face didn't have any sign of color. Both of her eyes were tightly shut, her long eyebrows had a little frost on them. It looked like a frozen tear. Mo Fan hurriedly carried her out, but only felt that freezing, cold death. Xinxia! Mo Fan felt like he was hit by a thunderbolt. Wake up! Wake up! I'm Mo Fan! I'm Mo Fan! I'm here to save you! The fire from Mo Fan's body began to burn. He held the petite body of Xinxia in his arms, hoping that the flames could help the frozen Yi Xinsha awaken. Heat constantly transferred, swiftly clearing away the frost that tried to take a girl's life. Her body started to slowly warm up. Her almost stagnant breath was also starting to follow along. Opening her heavy eyes, one very warm body holding her tightly. Yi Xinsha felt that the warmth was something she never experienced, but also that it was very familiar. "Brother Mo Fan?" Yi Xinsha's voice was so weak that it almost couldn't be heard, and she couldn't believe that it was him. Some said that before a person died, they would have illusions. Yi Xinsha was scared that this was the last flare of happiness that a girl selling matchsticks would see. But being held tightly felt so real. Mo Fan heard a sound. He then realized it was Yi Xinsha. She had opened her eyes and was talking gibberish. In front of a disaster, everybody's lives were so weak. Mo Fan had already seen so many girls die during this disaster. He was so afraid that this would happen to Yi Xinsha too. After all, other people had the ability to run away, but what about her? Mo Fan came here unfaltered. He knew that Yi Xinsha was crippled and definitely would be abandoned in a place somewhere, helplessly waiting for death. "Brother Mo Fan, I thought I would never see you again." Yi Xinsha's heart was melted away. Her soft arms hugged Mo Fan tight unconsciously, as if she was not willing to let go, wishing that she could melt into Mo Fan's warm body. "How could I leave you alone and not care for you?" Mo Fan replied, his voice cracking. Yi Xinsha didn't reply, only hugged him tighter. The whole world could abandon her, but Mo Fan definitely would not. Knowing this fact, she now had no doubt of it. When the calamity broke out, and she had been left alone in the cold underground supermarket, Yi Xinsha had not shed any tears. Only when Mo Fan really showed up in front of her did the tears start to shower down uncontrollably. Chapter 117: The Miraculous Healing Element. After he put Yi Xinsha on her wheelchair, Mo Fan suddenly felt dizzy. As Yi Xinsha realized this, she asked, "What's wrong?" "Don't worry, I'm just a little dizzy," Mo Fan replied, his head spinning a bit. Thinking of which, ever since he left the underground holy spring, he hadn't had any rest. There were so many wounds on his body which he hadn't taken care of, and his mental focus was also exhausted. He wanted to take Yi Xinsha to leave this place. However, in his current state, he was no longer able to use intermediate magic, which required a large amount of magic energy. This worried Mo Fan considerably. "Your arm is bleeding profusely, you have lost too much blood." Yi Xinsha quickly discovered the astonishing wound on Mo Fan's arm. That wound was casually wrapped with a cloth. However, it hadn't stopped the bleeding. "Oh, when I was dealing with the black beast monsters before." Mo Fan only now realized this. His wound was fairly painful. "Put it here." Yi Xinsha put Mo Fan's wounded arm on her thighs. Even with her silk skirt in between them, Mo Fan could still feel Yi Xinsha's smooth thighs. As his wrist accidentally touched them, her beautiful legs revealed a shocking elasticity. The pain and blood loss was soon put to the back of his mind. Yi Xinsha's thighs didn't have any scars, nor seemed misshapen or withered. When she was sitting down, she looked the same as any other girl. Furthermore, with her wearing a skirt, she possessed the beauty of a delicate piece of art, and a natural snowy white skin. Her jade-like radiance was at a level that completely infatuated others. Perhaps her two legs were too beautiful, and that was why the heavens had taken away her most important thing. No strength. Her two legs didn't have any little bit of strength. She was able to walk, but only a few steps before she would begin to gasp for air. It wasn't that she didn't regularly see any doctors, even they couldn't do anything about her problem. The more expensive hospitals were not something they could afford to go to, and so they could only delay this matter. As Mo Fan was enjoying this special treatment, a bizarre energy slowly emerged from Yi Xinsha's body. A pure white light appeared on Yi Xinsha's delicate fingertips. They blossomed with a distinctive luster, similar to water, flowing gently. These pure white lights slowly gathered within Yi Xinsha's small palms. She closed her beautiful eyes as she put her hand on Mo Fan's large wound. An itchy feeling quickly came through. Mo Fan saw his wound on his arm being slowly healed by the white light. They were just like a group of active, living spirits as they gathered on Mo Fan's injured flesh and reconnected his severed veins. While healing Mo Fan, she was able to maintain her energy. As Mo Fan saw this, he felt a bit astonished. The cut on his arm was healing at a visible speed. The gash around his elbow also began to heal, followed by the one on his shoulder also slowly mending itself. This kind of feeling, if you were to view the wound like a zipper, then healing was like someone slowly pulling the zipper up. Furthermore, the wound was no longer visible after the zipper was pulled up, leaving behind intact flesh. This was the healing element. This was the ability of the healing element. Mo Fan was filled with disbelief as he looked at Yi Xinxia, who had her eyes closed. Looking at her fully concentrating, his heart began to feel waves of astonishment. He had nearly forgotten that Xinxia was a healing elemental magician, the first person in the entirety of Bo City who had gotten this element on their first awakening. The vast majority of the people awakened a classical element on their first awakening: wind, fire, water, ice, lightning, light, or earth. However, there are bound to be exceptions amongst humans. Other than the classical elements that were being awakened on their first try, there was also white magic, black magic, and dimensional magic. The healing element belonged to white magic. Normally, you would only be able to find intermediate magicians who possessed healing magic. People like Yi Xinxia who awakened it on their first awakening were extremely rare. Beneath the warm glow of healing, his drowsy feeling from before had also vanished. It was clear that other than restoring his wounds, healing was also able to replenish lost blood to a certain degree. This event caused Mo Fan to be extremely happy. He never thought that his precious little Xinxia would have such an incomparable ability. If she was brought to the safety shelters, then Yi Xinxia would instantly become a very important person. After all, there was not a single medicine or method that could possibly be better than Yi Xinxia's ability to heal wounds. Xinxia, how strong is the effect of your healing? If you were to use healing right after someone had their throat severed, would you be able to save them? Mo Fan asked excitedly. Yi Xinxia shook her head. Healing is useless if your life is taken instantly. Oh, this is already very impressive. Mo Fan nodded. The veteran hunters, those who frequently fought magical beasts out in the wild, knew something. What truly killed you was not necessarily the attacks of a magical beast, but the accumulated wounds on your body. Wounds could bleed, get infected, worsen, and if you didn't get your wounds checked in time, then it was the equivalent of your life chipping away. Other than rations and water, the large majority of the veterans would bring medicine. Unfortunately, the effects of the medicine were far too slow, and were unable to keep up with the veterans who were always battling. If the squad had a healing magician, then this would no longer be a problem. Sometimes, it would be even more useful than defensive magic equipment. It would also substantially decrease the mortality rate of the squads, especially the squads that went on long and difficult treks. Are there any other wounds? Yi Xinxia cautiously inspected Mo Fan. Her small hands swept past Mo Fan's flesh without even touching his skin. The small wounds on his body instantly healed, including the bruises, bumps, and splash wounds. This miraculous event made Mo Fan also want this type of ability. Not long after, Mo Fan was completely healed. Despite the ragged clothes on his body, there were no bruises to be seen. Even his scars had completely disappeared. Haha. So it turns out my Xinxia is this amazing. Say, how about we start a clinic for removing scars? Who knows how much money we would be able to make? Mo Fan couldn't help but say this. Yi Xinxia gave him a supercilious look. Mo Fan also felt that he was being a bit immature. In any case, they were both divine magicians now. With his wounds no longer a burden, Mo Fan felt very comfortable. After gathering his spirit, Mo Fan pleasantly discovered the magic energy within his nebula had also restored itself a little. In this case, it meant he was still able to use intermediate level magic, and that would mean the magical beasts wouldn't be able to stop him.